I'm Larry Scarpa, architect from Los Angeles in Florida.
This is Angie Brooks of Brooks plus Scarpa Architects, and you're listening to U.S. Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. I'm Tom Guild. Earlier this year, our friends the Classicists gathered via Zoom to discuss traditional and classical architecture. As the day unfolded, modernism was predictably and continually pounded as the cause of all kinds of awful consequences on humanity. In fact, if this were football, the referee would blow the whistle at this point for piling on. Then, one voice of reason stood up. Today, we welcome Melissa DelVecchio of Robert A.M. Stern Associates, also known as RAMSA. Later, we'll hear from musical guest Paul Marinaro, a good friend of past podcast guest Eden Atwood. And now, here's someone who can talk about classicism without bashing it. Mr. Modernism, George Smart.
Thank you, Tom. The rhetoric of some classicists is pretty dark. Our past podcast guest David Bressot wrote, and I quote, "Traditional and modern architecture are opposites. One is good and the other is bad. One typology is beautiful, the other rejects beauty. Traditional architecture is conducive to human health. Modern architecture produces stress and disorientation." This is kind of like Goofus and Gallant in Highlights for Children.
Yeah.
David characterized in that meeting Tom mentioned earlier that it was a forum to discuss advances in their practice and the eventual displacement of modern architecture from its decades-long dominance of the profession. Wow. When we modernists get together, we don't bash traditional architecture. We like it. It's great. It's a big world. There's plenty of room for different styles. So it was most refreshing to learn that one of the classicist moderators, an architect with a distinguished career specializing in classical buildings, was a brilliant voice of reason, saying, and I quote, "We don't help classicism by bashing modern architecture." Well said. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs, and by modernist realtor Angela Roll. In a story that we are largely making up, modernist realtor Angela Roll worked her way through college, dancing like no one's watching to Mambo No. 5 and brilliantly house-flipping Neutra, sometimes simultaneously. At 22, following a celebrity-filled party at a famous hillside L.A. modernist house involving diving off the roof into the pool, absolute Le Mans, and a new use for WD-40, Angela was recruited to the architecture school, where after years of sleep-deprived design studios, she's now a modernist real estate agent with specialized training, advising buyers and sellers on everything from appropriate renovation to saving a completely doomed mid-century house from destruction. That last one is true. Reach her at angelaroll.com. That's ROEHL or 919-995-0550. Architect Melissa DelVecchio, FAIA, works for the famous firm Robert A.M. Stern in New York. She studied at the University of Notre Dame and Yale, and she later worked at Duane Plater Zyberk, designing the very classical Florida towns of Seaside and Windsor. Melissa joined Stern in 1998 and has been a partner since 2008. As Director of Research, her focus is complex academic projects, including the Benjamin Franklin College and Pauli Murray College at Yale, Schwarzman College at Tsinghua University in Beijing, Wasserstein Hall, Casperson Student Center, and the Clinical Wing for Harvard Law School, and the Hawks Hall at the University of Nebraska. Melissa is a co-author of Designs for Learning, College and University Buildings by Robert A.M. Stern Architects, and she's the editor of the New Residential Colleges at Yale. Here's my conversation with Melissa, taped about a month after that Zoom call. Melissa, I know a lot of people that follow modern architecture are unaware of all the classical organizations and awards and things that are available within that universe. Tell me about some of those.
There are so many. I won't be able to hit them all. I'm not even sure I know of them all, but I will tell you a few of the ones that I have been directly involved with. One of the major organizations that I've been involved with for a while is called the Institute of Classical Art and Architecture, and they're based in New York City. And since I became involved with them 20 years ago, they have had tremendous growth and have chapters in cities all across the US and a really robust awards program all across the US, including the Arthur Ross Awards, which they give yearly in New York, but many other design awards for individual projects that they give across the country on a chapter basis. They also do a tremendous amount of education, and over the pandemic have built up an amazing collection of videos, including the kind of continuing education things, as well as people giving tours of where they live or favorite places that they visited. I did one about the place where I spent the pandemic in the Catskills in New York, and there's plenty of others that are really fun to watch. One of the other worldwide organizations is called Intibau, and they're based in the UK, and they have chapters all over the world. They have a wonderful conference every year, which is coming up. So if people are interested in that, they can Google. And they're also very interested in craft and supporting artisans who really can build the projects that the traditional architects are designing. One of the major prizes, the most major prize that's available, is called the Dree Prize. And it's funded by the financier Richard Dree, who passed away just a year ago, and through the University of Notre Dame. And I'm on the jury for that prize. And that it's not for an individual project, it's really for a lifetime of work in the traditional and classical vein. And it's gone to some very prestigious folks, many of whom have been wonderful mentors to me. Robert Stern has received it, of course, my partner. And one of my teachers, Tom Beebe, who was really influential in my career. The winner this year is Rob Creer, who's the urbanist and brother of Leon Creer, who many more people know, who's also received the prize. The Dree Prize really grows out of the longstanding tradition of teaching traditional and classical architecture at the University of Notre Dame, which started when I was a first year there in 1989, when Thomas Gordon Smith, who was an architect who started his career in Berkeley and was very interested in pushing beyond postmodernism with classical forms, he completely changed the program. Many of us who signed up for the program didn't know what was about to happen. Actually, it was a surprise to me, and completely changed the program to one that was really based in the study of classical architecture, which fit nicely with the curriculum at Notre Dame, which for 50 years has had an amazing Rome program where the third-year students spend their entire year in Rome. So it was a program that I think fit nicely with his goals, and that tradition remained long after he left. He just died about a year ago.
And there's also the National Civic Arts Society in Washington.
Yeah, so I think that is another group that's really known for advocacy. And I think you have interviewed Justin Schiavo before.
He's been on the show before, right? A couple times.
Yeah, so he's really the heart and soul of that organization. And they've been arguing for the reconstruction of Penn Station. They've been protesting the Eisenhower Memorial in Washington, D.C. So I think of them as a bit more of an advocacy organization, but I actually may be wrong about that. They may do other things as well.
The reconstruction of Penn Station, it seems to be something that everybody agrees on, that it was just such a tragedy that it went away.
It was. I mean, the only saving grace of it is that it really gave a lot of energy to the historic preservation movement so that it was lost, but maybe other things were spared in the process. But it was a tremendous loss. I wish I were old enough to have seen it in person. It's just so sad to see those pictures of its demolition. I guess it was like slowly deconstructed more than demolished in one fell swoop. Yeah, so it's an interesting idea to put that back. I don't know. Who knows? Maybe it could happen. It's such a horrible place. Penn Station is such a horrible place right now. Although the Moynihan Train Hall is quite a nice addition to New York City and presents a much more dignified way of arriving.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the destruction of Penn Station, of course, has been attributed to helping save Grand Central Station, which was also endangered at one point during the 60s.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's had that wonderful renovation by Beyer Blinder Bell I guess almost more than 20 years ago now.
Yes.
But I've been commuting for the last few weeks. When we've started going back into the office, I've been commuting and start my day coming through Grand Central Station every morning, which is quite a nice way to arrive.
So another group that is involved with classicism is TAG.
Yeah.
What does that stand for?
TAG is the Traditional Architecture Gathering, and it was started by a fellow named Nir Burris, and he is interested in just, I guess, creating a safe space to just sit and discuss. And he creates a nice conference every year. I've been part of it twice. The conference is usually set up as roundtables or maybe speakers and question and answer. And it's a very casual kind of, or casually organized kind of conference, which is nice.
So it's not so formal with workshop after workshop after workshop kind of thing.
Well, it goes on and on like that, but some of the discussions are very open, and there's at least in the virtual world, there's a nice back and forth with people offering comments and questions in the chat, and it's a more casually organized event.
So we've had on the show previously a fellow named David Brissot, who was a very nice guest. He has very definite opinions about modernism. He wrote recently, "Traditional and modern architecture are opposites. One is good and the other is bad. One typology is beautiful, the other rejects beauty. Traditional architecture is conducive to human health. Modern architecture produces stress and disorientation." So pretty much good and evil here. And during this panel at TAG, you came up like somebody with great wisdom and said, hey, we don't help classicism by bashing modern architecture, which I guess was a minority view in that group.
Yeah, so I should explain a little bit about what the panel was about, which might make the quote from David make a little more sense to folks. So the panel that I was moderating was actually about this really interesting new realm of study in neuroscience. Many neuroscientists, mathematicians, physics professors around the country involved in doing this research. So it's actually not coming out of architecture, it's coming out of other disciplines. And it's about human innate reactions to the built environment around them. And what they have found and what they have demonstrated is that whether you think you like classical architecture or not, that most humans, because of the way our eyes and our brains work, have positive reactions to classical architecture, to the composition and arrangement of forms in classical architecture, and to the composition and arrangement of traditional urban environments where, there's a clearly defined street with street trees, or and it has to do with the way that our eyes and our brains work. A tremendous amount of the information that your body is processing when you're walking through a space is really coming through your eyes, much more so than what you're hearing or what you're smelling. It's mostly through your eyes. All our senses work together, but the majority of influence is what you're seeing. And humans really relate quite strongly to things that have simple symmetrical compositions or simple asymmetrical compositions, which are arranged with a series of internal symmetries that create an asymmetry, if you know what I mean. And they have actually demonstrated this with scanning software, like where your eyes go and what you focus on. And if you're looking at a blank glass box, your eyes in the first few seconds are not even focusing on that thing. They essentially don't even see it. They start to travel to the spaces around it. Whereas if you're looking at a simple house with a front door and a window, your eye knows where to go. And there's an association of what your eye is doing with how calm or agitated your brain might be. If your brain doesn't know what to look at, you're getting kind of agitated. And so people are starting to put together that when humans are in this kind of agitating environment, it is somewhat unhealthy for them because it's making you anxious all the time, even if you're not really conscious of it. And so the panel that I was moderating had Nikos Salangaros, who's a scientist from the University of Texas at San Antonio, and Richard Taylor, who's a scientist from University of Oregon, and Ann Sussman, who's another researcher in this area, and several others who are advocating for more attention to how the built environment affects human well-being. And during this conversation, there were some modernists that piped up in the chat and were questioning the research, which I think is fair because it's new and it has a way to go. And I was pretty skeptical of it when I first read about it, but after talking to these folks in the panel discussion, I was quite interested in where it's going. I think we should all be paying attention to it. But some of the modernists piped up and said, well, this doesn't really make sense. You could probably make sense of this with anything. And they weren't really believing it. And some of the classicists on the panel, or even in the audience, were pushing back with the kind of language that you just read from David about this kind of good and evil, which I just don't think is very useful. I think there's a lot of problems in the world today that architects can help to solve. And if we spend our time arguing with each other from the standpoint of good and evil, instead of paying attention to research and trying to design more human-centered environments, I think we're doing the world a disservice.
And I couldn't agree with you more. I guess what puzzles me a little bit is when I get together with people who were really into modernism, as I was at Modernism Week a while back, there was not a single conversation bashing classical architecture. It's like modernists generally love classical architecture just as much as they love anything else. But there seemed to be a core group of people out there that really dislike modernist architecture on such a profound level. It's just surprising.
Well, I think those modernists are really in the majority. I mean, most of the high-profile public projects that we see getting built are not classical projects. And I think, you saw the reaction when Donald Trump tried to make a statement that federal buildings should be classical, and the architecture community came out in force. And so I think being in the minority always makes people a little defensive, and those who are in the majority and who are getting many of the plum projects don't really have a reason to debate, let's say. And, I think many of the modernist architects appreciate the history of architecture. But if they see something that's designed that way now, sometimes they'll claim that they just really don't even know what to do with that information. They can't even evaluate it. I mean, I've been on juries with folks who are modernists evaluating a classical project, and they just say, well, I don't even know how to evaluate this. This isn't what I do. We all studied architectural history. We all studied the basics of classical composition as part of those courses. And if you know those principles, you are fully capable of evaluating those things. And in fact, I think some of the best projects come from architects who have a respect for both and try to hybridize or synthesize those ideas into something that, solves modern day problems, but also is kind to its neighbors on the site. I mean, the things that the classicists really are arguing for is buildings that are kind to their neighbors. Buildings, a lot of modernist buildings are kind of me architecture. It's all about the architect's artistic voice, maybe more so than the client, or it's all about being the super shining star. And it's not about the basics of creating buildings that create streets that create blocks that create cities and create coherent environments for our communities. And, the classicists, I think, quite rightly on occasion look around them and see some cities that have really been destroyed, that were really wonderful spaces that support healthy communities, and they want to speak out against that.
So what do you wish modernist fans understood better about classical architecture?
I think there's often a reaction to classical architecture being mostly about ornament or decoration, or not being suitable for modern life, or that somehow the architecture that we make has to, be of its time. But, what is of its time? I think of its time this year might be different than of its time 2 years from now. And what does that get you when you're trying to create a whole campus or a whole city or a whole community. I mean, there's always a place for some special thing, like the Bilbao Museum on the river is like a beautiful blooming flower, and it's a special thing, and it's a museum, and there's always a place for that.
Or like an airport, for instance.
Well, yeah. And airports should be wonderful gateways to cities. They should be special and they should be exciting. And there's a place for that. But if every building is that thing, then you start creating, I think, these environments that may create some anxiety with people, as these neuroscientists have been pointing out, or that may just not make a space that lasts. I mean, sustainability is really important for us right now as a human race. And we need to save the buildings that we have because that's the most sustainable thing that you can do. But we also need to build buildings for the long term. We need to build them out of good, solid materials. We need to build them to last. We need to build buildings that are flexible, that can be something different 100 years from now than we might be building them for. And that's what's going to really make a difference to the planet in terms of sustainability. And we need to build buildings that do the kind of low-tech, smart things that make sense from an energy standpoint. And, building a glass box in the middle of Florida and covering it with solar panels may get you LEED points, but it's not necessarily the most logical, sustainable thing to do. And so I think a lot of what the traditionalists are often arguing for goes much deeper than what the buildings look like, to how they perform in a city context, how they play with their neighbors, how flexible are they over time. They address all these different issues, and I think sometimes the modernists don't give those arguments enough credit, even though I think strangely the climate crisis has started to make them more aware of all these things, and oftentimes they're thinking the same things but addressing the problems differently. And I just see similar ideas coming about on both sides. And I feel like there's more common ground that could be found, and there's more that we can do together if we talk about it.
What are some of the more traditional buildings that your firm, the Robert A.M. Stern, has done in the last few years that maybe the public isn't aware of?
Well, I can talk about some of my latest projects. So we finished in 2017, I think it was, just a bit before the pandemic, 2 new residential colleges at Yale on a 7-acre triangular piece of land between the Ingalls Rink and the Grove Street Cemetery in New Haven. And those are traditional buildings. They are collegiate Gothic in the same vein as James Gamble Rogers was doing in the 1930s. And the reason for that was that the university was very much trying to link together the main campus with Science Hill. And this was a site that most Yale students, really thought of as being quite far from the center of the university. I mean, Yale students' sense of distance is a little bit distorted, but this really was a little bit far from the university center. And so the idea of working in that traditional style was to link together the existing campus with Science Hill and really create what was an identifiable Yale context and draw those 2 pieces of the campus together. And it has been extremely successful in doing that. We did it very carefully with a lot of study of how James Gamble Rogers was working. I mean, at the time that James Gamble Rogers was building the other collegiate Gothic colleges at Yale, collegiate Gothic wasn't necessarily the obvious choice or the avant-garde thing to do either. It was a very conscious decision on the part of Yale administrators to create a kind of continuous context that was identifiable as Yale. And they did that with some collegiate Gothic buildings and some more Georgian Revival buildings, but they were not the avant-garde of the time, and it was done very intentionally. And what that left Yale with, which is interesting, is such a wonderful background where later in the 1960s, when they started building things like the Beinecke Library or the Architecture School or the Yale Art Gallery, the modernist buildings at Yale really shine. But the reason that they do is that they sit within a very identifiable contiguous context where they play well with their neighbors.
So they support each other in that, right?
They support each other, yeah. And so then following that, we were able to work on just up the street, just up Prospect Street from those colleges, we just finished the Schwarzman Center, which is a renovation of a 1901 Carrera and Hastings bicentennial buildings. It was just published in February in Architectural Record. It was a really amazing project because it was as difficult as those colleges were. No one had touched this building really since 1901, and we were able to make some very simple additions to the exterior and underground additions and transform what had been the first year dining hall into a full student center that's set up for major arts performances as well. And so there's an idea to actually program the student center with arts activities and symposia to really bring the whole campus together, because Yale's always been a wonderful constellation of the communities and all the colleges, but there hasn't really been a central place where graduate students, undergraduates, faculty, and the whole university community can come together. And so that's what this is going to be. And for this project, we followed a little bit. We did a little research and found an unexecuted Carrera and Hastings sketch for an addition on Grove Street. And we kind of followed that model, but in a new way. The floor of the main dining hall had to be replaced, which actually allowed us to dig out the basement a little bit and turn what had been a kind of Downton Abbey-esque range of kitchens, service spaces below into some really wonderful student spaces and performance spaces.
If you want to see the two residence colleges that Melissa and her firm did, just Google Benjamin Franklin College and Pauli Murray College at Yale University. Have you gotten a chance, Melissa, to go over to the Pirelli building in New Haven?
I know it. I haven't. I know it. And I've been to the IKEA many times. And I know that during the pandemic, it was getting renovated into a hotel.
A hotel.
Right? Is that right?
Yes.
I have not seen it yet. No. Is it It's finished?
Yes, it certainly is. Very exciting. We're going to be taking a group up there probably later this year.
Oh, I'd love to join you. We can all go out to Sally's Pizza afterward.
Yeah. Imagine that. Classicists and Modernists having a meal. Well, thank you so much for talking with me. It's been such a pleasure.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me. This is terrific.
That was George Smart chatting with Melissa DelVecchio.
The youngest of 10 children, jazz vocalist Paul Marinaro grew up studying music and performing in Buffalo, New York, before moving to Chicago in 2003. His voice has been called a modern classic, and he performed sold-out shows at places such as Siegel's Jazz Showcase, the Green Mill, Andy's Jazz Club, and the Winters Jazz Club. He was featured at several Chicago jazz festivals, and his 2013 debut album, Without a Song, was followed up by a live album one night in Chicago. We got to know Paul through his good friend, past podcast guest Eden Atwood. Welcome, Paul.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Hey, thanks for joining us. I understand that at some point in your childhood, you found some records of your dad's in the attic.
I sure did.
What were those?
Well, my dad, first generation in America, his father had come from Italy. So when he was growing up, he just absorbed everything he could on the radio, different radio shows, particularly very early Sinatra stuff. And my dad had wanted to be a singer so badly. He worked odd jobs and saved his money and bought a record cutter back in 1946.
You might have to explain for people what a record cutter is.
Yeah, what is that?
Cutter, well, back then, the only way you could record yourself, there was no tape, there was obviously no digital, so the only way to really record for the general public was to have these type of machines that would basically cut your voice into the grooves of an acetate, which was basically just, a thin coating on an aluminum disc. They were basically, novelty, not intended to last very long. But somehow these have lasted 67 years. And as a kid, I found them and began playing them, rickety 78 RPM, very, very lo-fi, but I heard my dad singing standards as a teenager. And that was my introduction to this kind of music, to that genre, was from my dad. And I was so fascinated that he was able to get his voice into those grooves. So they still are treasures for me.
And were you able to use any of those recordings in your own albums?
They were so badly damaged by the time I had started thinking about restoring them that we had to go groove by groove.
Oh, wow.
At a very slow speed because the needle, would not stay in the grooves because they had been warped and some of the material had flaked away. But once we got everything very slowly into the digital realm, I was able to piece it back together. And I did use just brief clips of them in my album to kind of complete the story. My first album was a tribute to my father and kind of the idea of lost dreams and unfulfilled dreams, particularly his, of singing. Kind of show him that, his early efforts didn't go to waste and that they inspired his youngest son.
And what did he say when your album came out?
Well, my father was quite sick at that time. His health had begun to fail, and that really gave him 2 solid years of just joy. He was just overwhelmed by it, and I think it kind of came full circle for him. So he flew out to Chicago. He was in the audience when we debuted it, and on the album we include a couple digitally created duets with my dad. So it really gave him a chance to get some recognition and, tap into those lost dreams.
One of the songs that Paul's dad recorded, that Paul has recorded, was written in 1942 by Harold Arlen and Johnny Mercer for the film Star Spangled Rhythm. Although sung by Johnny Johnston, Johnny Mercer's former girlfriend, Judy Garland, released it shortly afterwards to much acclaim. It's been covered by Glenn Miller, Sammy Davis Jr., Marilyn Monroe, and even Jerry Lewis in The Nutty Professor. Johnny Mathis had a disco version in 1979.
Oh, poor Johnny.
And this song appears several times in Star Trek Voyager, featuring singing by Jerry Ryan as Seven of Nine and Robert Picardo as the Doctor, with Harry Kim's band, the Kimtones. That's our Star Trek trivia for today. Here's Paul singing the tune his dad recorded, That Old Black Magic.
That old black magic has me in its spell. That old black magic that you weave so well. As I see fingers up and down my spine, the same old witchcraft when your eyes meet mine. Same old tingle that I feel inside. Then that elevator starts its ride. Down and down I go, round and round I go, like a leaf that's caught the tide. I should stay away, what can I do? I hear your name, and I'm a flame with such a burning desire, that only a kiss put out the fire. You're the lover I have waited for, you're the mate that fate had me created for. And every time your lips meet mine, darling, down and down I go, round and round I go, in a spin. I'm loving the spin I'm in, under that old black magic called love. That old black magic has me in its spell. That old black magic that you weave so well. Those icy fingers up and down my spine, with that same old witchcraft when your eyes meet mine. That same old tingle that I feel inside. Then that elevator starts its ride. Down and down I go, round and round I go, like a leaf that's caught in a tide. I should stay away, what can I do? I hear your name, and I'm a flame with such a burning desire, that only a kiss put out the fire. You're the lover I have waited for, you're the mate that fate had me created for. And every time your lips meet mine, darling, down and down I go, round and round I go, in a spin. I'm loving the spin I'm in, under that old black magic called love. such a burning desire that only a kiss put out the fire. You're the lover I have waited for. You're the mate that fate had me created for. And every time your lips meet mine, darling, down and down I go, round and round I go. In a spin, I'm loving a spin, I'm in. I'm under that old black magic called love. I'm in a spin, I'm loving a spin, I'm in. Under that old black magic called love. I'm in a spin, loving a spin, I'm in. Under that old black magic called love.
That is fabulous, Paul.
Oh, thank you so much. I haven't listened to that in a while.
This last couple of years, you've had the pandemic and you had a health scare a little while back with diverticulitis, right?
Well, that was the ongoing condition, and I thought I was managing it, and it got quite serious. Actually got to become life-threatening, and it forced me to have several surgeries and take most of 2018 off, which was, kind of difficult because a lot of this type of career depends on momentum and constantly pushing forward. So to be removed from that for a year was rather difficult, but I really wanted to ensure that 2019 mattered, and I had an incredible 2019 and was starting to tour Europe and just different opportunities and working on several different recordings. And then, of course, the 2020 hit and changed all of that for all of us. So it's been an interesting several years of starts and stops and being caught in limbo, which, we've all had to deal with individually and collectively.
So did you get it under control?
I did. Well, I had no choice. It ruptured at a gig, and I went into sepsis. Okay. So surgeries took care of it, and I haven't had any symptoms or anything like that, any flare-ups since. So
Great.
Health is good, thankfully, and that's really all that matters.
Now, do you have any advice, Paul, for stubborn men who won't go to the doctor?
I was one of them, and I really was. I can't say otherwise. I'm embarrassed that it got as bad as it did. It didn't need to, and it should have been taken care of because I really pushed it to the limit, and I was probably closer to the other side than this side of life. Don't be stubborn. That's my advice.
In 2019, you toured quite a lot for the Nat King Cole Centennial concerts.
I did. It's interesting because I shy away from some things thematically, whether they're tribute shows to Sinatra or for particularly that one for Nat Cole, because I find that audiences expect in those situations there to be imitators or maybe greatest hits packages, and I don't really do that. So I was initially worried about that, about those shows for the Nat Cole Centennial, and I was very, very happy that all the audiences that we delivered the performances to were very excited about the fact that I didn't do that I kind of gave a different history of Nat King Cole and focused a lot on his early work. It was an incredible year. Really had such a great time with different musicians I worked with and delving into that material that I normally hadn't done.
Is there any kind of competition show, Paul, for jazz musicians like America's Got Talent sort of format? Because I would think you would do really well.
America's Got Rhythm?
Yeah, anything.
I don't know. There might be. I'm so non-competitive. When competition is attached to music, it kind of is a turnoff for me.
Yeah.
So it's something like that might exist, but, whenever you attach the realm of competition to music, it tends to become more of a popularity contest than any real value in my estimation. So I'm not sure. We'll have to look into that.
Well, if you go to one,
let me know.
Yeah, we'll be Team Marinaro. Absolutely.
I'd love it.
Once Again, or Outra Vez, was written by legendary Brazilian composer Antonio Carlos Jobim, who you'll recall wrote The Girl from Ipanema that we've discussed with past podcast guest Eliane Elias. Consider the father of bossa nova. Jobim merged bossa nova with jazz in the 1960s to create a wildly popular sound that has become part of the modernist vibe. From his 2015 album, Live in Chicago, here's Paul with Once Again.
Once again, without you. Once again, without love. Once again, we have quarreled, but now you've left me all alone. Once again, how I cried, how I tried to forget. Once again, I still want you, but now you've left me all alone. People see me and they wonder why I feel so sad and lonely. Well, everything is sorrow, bringing only thoughts of you. Living doesn't mean a thing, I'm so all alone and blue. It seems to me I'm always crying. Well, what's a lonely heart to do? Once again, without you. Once again, without love. How I long for the moment to be together once again. See me and they wonder why I feel so sad and lonely. Well, everything is sorrow, bringing only thoughts of you. Living doesn't mean a thing, I'm so all alone and blue. It seems to me I'm always crying. What's a lonely heart to do? Once again, without you. Once again, without love. How I long for the moment to be together once again. Together once again. Together once again. Thank you. It's the wonderful Antonio Carlos
Jobim. That's ocho vez.
Paul, what new music have you got coming out?
Well, I'm actually really excited. We're working in post-production right now on two projects, kind of a little bit out of the box. It's a little unusual for me. And it was a project that we started during the pandemic, really themes that kind of tie into all of those emotions and feelings that we all went through. And it's a reimagining of David Bowie. We're doing an entire album with David Bowie, and it's with Metropolitan Jazz Octet. So it's kind of artsy jazz reinterpretation.
What songs, for example?
Well, we didn't want to we weren't interested in doing a greatest hits album. I really only wanted to do songs that spoke to me and that I thought that I could reinterpret without mimicking him in any way, because that would have been a disaster. But we did songs like Changes, Life on Mars, Quicksand, I Would Be Your Slave. It kind of cuts across, and then some hidden gems early on in his career, like a really stunningly beautiful song called Conversation Piece that didn't get as much attention, but it's, there's quite a bit of depth in those lyrics. And the goal was just to showcase David Bowie as a songwriter and strip it away, if we could, from David Bowie the entertainer and the artifice of the showman that he was, and just see if we could reinterpret this material. So that was really secretive for a long time, but we're starting to talk about it, and that'll be out this year.
Have you begun recording that yet?
Oh, it's finished.
It's done.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's we're in the mix process now and post-production. And I also recorded my own project, which has been a long time in the making. And it morphed into something completely new. But it's a new project by me, and it's also kind of born out of the pandemic and that sense of isolation and that sense of being stuck in limbo and what's next. It's mostly standards, but they have a different twist to them, and they come from a different place that has strings on it and horns. So it's quite a big production, and I'm really excited about that one. So I have two things coming out, hopefully by the end of the year.
Paul, what's your website, and where can people reach you?
PaulMarinaro.com.
That's MarinAro.com.
Exactly, yeah. I'm on Facebook, and I'm going to be stepping it all up again. It's really nice to be back out in front of audiences again, and we're just releasing a bunch of tickets for some big shows here in Chicago, and then hopefully get back to New York and eventually Europe again.
Well, please put us on your mailing list, and please say hello to Eden for us.
I will. I will call her and thank her as well.
Thanks for joining us, Paul.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure chatting. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks for listening. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs. And by Modernist realtor Angela Roll. Okay, Tom, take us out.
Visit usmodernist.org's massive archives to listen to past shows, discover documentation of 15,000 significant modernist houses, and access 4 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song was performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl. Rogue archivist Carrie Cesarino's sleek Razor laptop developed a battery seizure, so she's working off an iPad this week. Why you need to know that, I have no idea. I just read these things. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive Incorporated, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guile. George and I'll be back soon with another respectful to everyone, why can't we all get along edition of U.S. Modernist Radio.